Is there someone you know whose behavior scares you? Someone you suspect could easily be at the center of the next tragedy like the alleged Tucson shooter? We'll tell you if you could avoid another Tucson tragedy right now on It's Your Call. As the victims of the early January Tucson shooting spree are laid to rest and the survivors move towards recovery, our attention shifts now to the legal proceedings awaiting the alleged gunman. Acquaintances are saying they were afraid Jared Loughner would do something like this and have described his actions before the rampage as bizarre, volatile, and just plain scary. Do you know anyone like that? Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Doyle. So many times after a tragedy like the one that we witnessed in Arizona, we hear interviews with people who say, I always knew he or she would do something like that, but I didn't know what to do about it. Well, today we're going to give you some advice on what, if anything, you could do if you suspect someone potentially is dangerous to your community. We are dedicating this show to the youngest victim of the Tucson shooting, Christina Green, who was the granddaughter of former Philadelphia Phillies manager Dallas Green, who, as you know, is still an integral part of the team's front office. She was, as you also know by now, at the event because of her budding interest in politics and was eulogized by President Obama. We hope the information we provide today may prevent anyone from becoming a victim, and of course, we are sending our sympathies to the entire Green family. Joining me in expressing our condolences is Jeff Lindy, who is an old friend of the show. He's an attorney and a former federal prosecutor. And joining us today also is Dr. Joseph Garbely, who is a licensed psychiatrist and the chief medical officer at Friends Hospital in Philadelphia. Gentlemen, thank you for being with me.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. I want to start with you, Dr. Garbely. Is it fair to say that this individual, the alleged shooter, showed all the classic signs of a psychotic break in the days and weeks leading up to this event?
Although we can't diagnose anyone from afar, it does appear to be that way. It seems as though he was isolating and somewhat quirky early on, middle school, high school, and at the end of high school, he became more and more erratic. And then when he was in community college, he began to become disorganized, and his MySpace posting shows that, talking about the government coming up with a new currency, a new language. And when people start talking in those terms, that usually means there's a thought disorder or psychosis.
Now, if we know someone who is showing those kinds of signs, do we automatically assume that he or she would become violent?
No. In fact, studies over the last 30 years show that mentally ill patients are only slightly more likely to have a violent outburst or commit a violent crime than everyone else.
Well, then why do some of these people tend to turn violent and others just tend to lose themselves?
Well, I think it's in the nature of his delusions. He had this very strong feeling about government controlling everyone else. He locked onto Congresswoman Giffords and began to deride her for being a fake, and he was sort of concentrated on her. And I think that he became more and more out of touch with reality. And I think that the ability to get his hands on guns and things of that sort made him more and more dangerous over time.
Of course, Jeff, that starts an entire debate about access to guns and who can get it. If there's no indication that an individual has a record of mental illness, there's really nothing on the books that says he or she could not have access to guns.
Yeah, and I'm glad to be on the show. I don't think I was brought on to espouse on my political philosophy about gun control. But as a lawyer, just talking about who gets a gun, you know, if you're not a felon and if you have a clean mental health background, you apply for a gun, you're going to get one. I mean, that's why you have a lot of East Coast cities want to make it a little harder to get a gun.
Well, of course, as you say, that debate on who should be able to have access to a gun is for another show, because here we're trying to prevent a tragedy. Some will say limiting access to guns would be one way to do it. But we also can't legislate if someone just seems like they're just plain wacky or quirky or crazy. Right. What do we do as citizens if we think someone is threatening?
Well, that's the problem. And the reason why it's not a gun control debate is because, as we know from any major inner city, tons and tons and tons of people who are not allowed to have guns are able to get them. Right. So that's really an issue that we can't concern ourselves with. Well, what you do concern yourself with is when somebody should be arrested or detained because they pose a threat. And as any good Philadelphia cop will tell you, or any good law enforcement officer anywhere in our area is going to tell you, unless somebody does something, it's in the vast majority of cases, the police can't do anything about it. Something has to happen first, and the first person who is going to decry that situation is a law enforcement officer. They're going to say, we would have loved to have taken the guy off the street, but there's nothing we could do about it.
The school did what it thought was the responsible thing by suspending him and suggesting that he get mental health analysis.
But they could have gone further than that, and I think that, and I'm not knocking them for not. They may not have known what they could do, but when someone is acting so out of touch with reality and becoming a divisive force, and in some cases described as scary outbursts, I think it is incumbent upon them to try and pull in people that know him best, that care about him, and get them involved in the process of getting him help. Because this is about getting him help,
right.
And that's what we don't do well enough.
And we still have that tendency not to want to get involved in other people's business. And the other thing I found to be interesting in this is he's 22 years old. As someone who has adult children, gets to a point where, at what point should the parents have been more involved, or could they have even been more involved? I feel tremendous empathy for them, yes, because they may have witnessed their son going downhill and not knowing what to do about it.
Right. What politicians will tell you, and anybody with any law enforcement area that's in Philadelphia, in Harrisburg, and Washington, what they will all tell you is that public officials get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of threats every year. In the vast majority of those threats, nothing happens. And so perhaps to sympathize with the parents, you might have a parent saying, well, my son seems crazy, but it's so unlikely that anything bad is going to happen. And I think that's a natural parental instinct.
And after they're 21 years old, you can't really force them to do something, right?
Well, he was living at home at times and then in a hotel room at other times. So they can't really force him to do anything, but they could get him in front of a mental health professional if they were so concerned.
If he would go.
If he would go.
I mean, I'm sure there are people watching this show who say, I couldn't get my 22-year-old son to do anything.
But there's actually mechanisms in place that if any dangerous behavior was witnessed, even speaking about dangerous behavior, in the state of Pennsylvania, there's the Mental Health Procedures Act of 1976, and there's a clause called Section 302, where you can get that person in front of a mental health professional so that they can be evaluated. And then it's up to the professional to decide whether that person needs to be detained and further evaluated.
So we have to take a quick break, but your suggestion, no matter where people live, Pennsylvania or elsewhere in the nation, that if they suspect that a loved one is facing some challenges, to get them in front of a mental health professional.
And do it out of love, and try to do it with have them willingly do it. But if it becomes dangerous to themselves or other people, to use the statute of the 302.
Okay, on that note, we will take a quick break, but when we come back, would you know what to do if someone around you became violent? And what should you do if there's an active shooter where you are? We're going to have you some advice on that when we come back. And of course, if you'd like to tell us what you think about this latest tragedy, you can email me at lynn@lyndoyle.net.